I do want to start by echoing what Mr. Stanton said. This jury, I think about every one of you, said something to the effect of you didn't really want to be here, but if it was your civic duty, you would do it. And I appreciate you all showing up every day, attentive, punctual. It's hard to pay attention to everything. I know we put on a lot. And not every jury does that, frankly. And you all have been really impressive, and I appreciate it. Now, you already did the first part, rendering the verdict that he's guilty of capital murder, according to his plea. That means he will spend the rest of his life in prison. We know that. The prosecutor gave you the list of different charges. Whether or not that gets a death penalty is not about comparing different capital murders. It's not about whether comparing what happened to Athena to a mass murder, or to the murder of a police officer or a judge or anything like that, and which is worse. We've already told you that Texas law is always satisfied with life without parole for a capital murder. In this case, any case, the worst case you can imagine. We talked about what you would do in the punishment phase. It's different than the fact-finding phase. It's different than that guilt-innocent phase. I told you that it's going to be your individual moral judgment. Now I want to point out to you in your punishment instructions, the judge included some language in here, just what we told you before. Each of you must decide the case for yourself, but only after an impartial consideration of the evidence with your fellow jurors. Remember we talked about what deliberating means. We're attorneys. If we meant for you to argue, to fight, to berate each other, we know what those words are. The judge put it, an impartial consideration of the evidence with your fellow jurors. But he also added, do not give up your honest beliefs as to the weight or effect of the evidence solely because of the opinion of your fellow jurors, or for the mere purpose of answering the special issues. The special issues are how we decide whether or not Tanner gets a death sentence. I am completely satisfied that all of you took your oath and meant it. Now what that means, and I'm only going to talk to you about special one, is that you have to apply this. Whether there's a probability that the defendant would commit criminal acts of violence that would constitute a continuing threat to society. And Susan or I explained to each one of you when we talked individually that this is where that individual moral judgment comes in. That you're going to define what these terms mean. What a probability is. What a criminal act of violence is. What continuing is. And though the prosecutor and a lot of you gave you some suggestions that could be ongoing for continuing acts of violence, could be something, assault, things like that. But that's ultimately going to be up to you. We did talk about society being prison, a more secure society than any of us live in day to day. And I'll get back to that in a minute. But remember, this proof has to be beyond a reasonable doubt. I told you before, I gave you the sample. All that language is still here. Prosecution has the burden of proving that the answer to special issue number 1 is yes, beyond a reasonable doubt. Frankly, they spent their 2 weeks proving the case that he pled guilty to, talking about lying and waste of resources. They didn't put on any evidence that Tanner Horner is going to be a continuing threat to society in prison. Nothing. Your instructions are you may not answer the special issue number 1 yes unless you agree unanimously. You may not answer it no unless 10 or more jurors. We went over that. 10, 11, or 12 to answer the no. But I just read to you, you're not to give up your individual moral judgment. That's what you need to bring back to the court. So if you don't meet that 10, you don't meet that 12, that's fine. The judge knows what to do. We've already told you, you leave that blank, have the foreperson sign it, and the judge will take care of it. There's no mistrial. There's no hung juries. This is capital punishment, and it's different. I do want to talk a little bit, even though Tanner did plead guilty, I do want to talk a little bit about the prosecution's case. He told you his theme was lying. Brought it up again. There's nothing about lying on here. Frankly, go back to creation. Lying was humans' first reaction to getting caught doing something bad. Deputy Amy handled every piece of physical evidence in this case. Handled every photograph. She did something wrong, and she lied, and she lied again, and she lied again, and made it all worse. This isn't about lying. Ranger Espinoza told you he lies as an interrogation technique. He lied in this case to get the information he wanted. This case isn't about lying. You don't get the death sentence for lying. There was a theme with our experts. Every one of them, they asked him about insanity. Tanner pled guilty. We didn't raise the not guilty by reason of insanity defense. That was a waste of time. They argued that Tanner wasted resources. But they played you that December 7th video. Now, had I been his attorney on that date, I would have wanted to be there. I don't think it's right that you interrogate somebody after they have an attorney appointed for them, or when they're asking for an attorney. But they did it anyway, and what he did was offer to plead guilty, to plead no contest, to accept a minimum of life without parole. And he wanted out for Christmas, and they mocked it. He wanted out for Christmas with his son, and they made fun of him. Like that wasn't reasonable. He could have been out that day if he'd had cash. He had a bond. Him going home from Christmas was not unreasonable. Beginning a negotiation with an offer and an ask is what happens every time. Most cases in America don't go to trial. They're pled out. Now the answer can be, no, we want you to plead guilty. No, we're not going to agree to a lower bond. That's what negotiation is. Frankly, if you go to buy a house tomorrow, you're going to make an offer of what you're willing to pay for it, and you're going to ask for the refrigerator, or for closing costs, or for something else. And the other party may say no, and you may still end up buying the house. This case could have been over in December of 2022. No one took it seriously. I don't even know if it went to the prosecutors. Definitely didn't get to a judge. That wasn't ridiculous. Now, yeah, you've seen his videos. Everything Tanner does is off. So maybe they didn't take him seriously because when he made his offer, he sounded weird. Oh, of course we're not going to let you out for Christmas. He could have been out that day. $1.5 million bond. It's America. If he had cash, he would have been walking. So to mock him for it is, frankly, it's ridiculous. I deal with a lot of clients that don't know how to negotiate. That's why the attorney should have been there. The other thing that's kind of frustrated me in this case is and I hate to belabor it, the kind of the misrepresentation of some of the evidence. Going back to the medical examiner's report, and you have all these reports. So if you're interested in any of them, you want to look at it, you can. The medical examiner testified and put in her report, the external genitalia, anus, and perineum are unremarkable. No trauma is appreciated on the vagina, or the vaginal labia, or within the vaginal vault. The vaginal hymen is present, intact, and unremarkable. No trauma is appreciated within the anus or the perianal skin. Prosecutors and medical people are allowed to tell you that evidence of sexual assault in a medical examiner's report is proof, but absence of it is not disproof. That's illogical, but that's how that is. No fractures were palpable within the facial bones. No fractures anywhere in her body. The other thing that isn't in her report, but she testified to, was that her autopsy tech did the swab for the DNA. She testified here that her tech swabbed inside and out. There are no swabs of inside the cavities. There weren't separate swabs. Why that matters is when you actually read the DNA reports, and I'm only going to bring up 3 of them because that's all that really mattered. There's a lot of reports that he had DNA on his own clothes, whatever. Starting with this April 19th, 2023 report. Quesada testified to it. She had to do it within 90 days to see if this was a sex assault case or not. The phrases epithelial cell fraction and sperm cell fraction don't mean what you think they mean. It tells you right in this report. Quesada testified to it. Epithelial cell fraction could contain semen. Sperm cell fraction can contain skin cells. The notations of epithelial cell fraction and sperm cell fraction are for sample tracking purposes only and are not intended to indicate the source of the DNA. This April 2023 DNA analysis, the likelihood ratio indicates support for the proposition that the suspect is excluded as a possible contributor to the profile. So this first DNA sample excluded. It was someone else's DNA. They also put in here, remember Quesada testified to this, and I think Ferreira too. The only way to figure out if a sample is semen is to look under a microscope for sperm cells. They didn't do that. This first report in April 2023 tells them, please note that no testing to confirm the presence of semen was conducted on the vaginal swabs. If testing to confirm the presence of semen is needed, please contact this laboratory for instructions. That's how you would have figured it out. Nobody did that. Then they come back with a supplemental report. This update is not due to an error in previous testing. It's just a repeat of that April 2023 report 2.5 years later. So 2.5 years later, and they tell you, which is fair I guess, that this is just wordplay. At the request of the Wise County District Attorney's Office, this supplemental report communicates the results using new guidelines implemented on November 28, 2023 involving the addition of verbal scale qualifiers. So they come back around, print the same report, but this time they change it to the likelihood ratio indicates limited support for the proposition that the suspect is excluded. And they don't include the language about how to check, how to find out if this is sperm or not. Probably because they already did the same report on the Y-star. This is the DNA Y-star from September 15, 2025, 2.5 years after the first one. Remember Quesada testified she didn't take those swabs. She's not saying it's epithelial skin or skin cells. She's not saying it's semen cells. The swabs were taken externally. Unfortunately, we know Tanner undressed Athena. Tanner covered Athena's mouth. This report doesn't tell us anything more than that. I had a brief discussion with Ms. Quesada about how little DNA was there. It's an infinitesimally small amount. Every time it got brought up, I tried to object that these were somehow proof of sexual assault. They're just not. The medical examiner's report and the DNA reports. The actual issue, whether or not he's going to be a continuing threat to society. We started our case with Professor Edens, who has actually done research on what matters, what can be predicted, what isn't predicted. Actually looked at Texas inmates who had people testify that they were going to be a future danger. Some of those people were on death row, some had life without parole, some got exonerated. Proven they weren't guilty and they went home. But all of them had people saying that they were going to be a future danger without any research to back it. Now, Professor Eaton did say there are things that do matter. If you go to prison the first time between 18 and 21, if you have a lower education, don't have at least a high school diploma or a GED. If you're a member of a gang, on the outside or when you get in, there's a higher likelihood that there's going to be violence. And if you've been to prison before, or you've committed violence while you're in prison. Those would seem like common sense, but he also went through the hard work of researching it and teaching people how to look at this. For Tanner, none of those apply. Tanner was 31 when he went to prison. Tanner is not the person you see on the news who's been arrested 31 times and released despite it being violent crimes. This is Tanner's first time. He has his high school diploma, not a member of a gang, obviously. 2 jails, plenty of people, female, male, volunteers, religious meetings. You've heard, obviously, every expert we brought up here, he went to visit them, transported for his brain scans, transported between the jails, transported to court. No write-ups with either group of people. No write-ups in either jail. Then, yesterday we got to hear someone who's actually putting these kind of ideas into practice. Director Fitzpatrick is in charge of classification. He told you his top priority is public safety. Safety of staff, safety of visitors, safety of inmates. 142,000 inmates plus in TDCJ right now. 30,000 employees. 29,000 approved visitors. If all of them were subject to violence, that wouldn't be true. We'd have 29,000 volunteers. Director Fitzpatrick told you he uses evidence-based practices to classify people to determine where to house them based on their needs, but number one, based on safety. Takes a holistic approach, looking at medical, looking at mental health, looking at history, criminology, trying to rehabilitate if there's drug issues, trying to do vocational training, do education, all those things that would hold you back and might bring you back to prison. Let 50,000 out, 56,000 in. He's thinking about that all the time. Individual treatment plans for rehabilitation. Complete medical and mental health workups before they do the classifications to know what they need, where they're going to need to be housed. 34 facilities that all have different ways to house somebody. There's a classification profile for each inmate that's constantly updated. Incentive programs. They try to make like parole is the only incentive. It's not. Where you're housed, whether you can work, freedom to move about. Those are all incentives. Remember I told you, yes, this is a society, but it's not our society. This society has 24/7 security. It has trained staff. It has appropriate screening for the visitors. Trying to make it sound like they're walking around there. No, mass movement is when a group of people have a place to be, and they have to be moving to where they're supposed to be. Otherwise, individually, you have to have that path and be going where you're supposed to be going. It's not a free-for-all. And ultimately, their expert said they have a reasonable and effective way to house someone who's been sentenced to life without parole while ensuring the safety of the public, the staff, those visitors, and the inmates. Did have one point of contention. Tanner's friend Jamarius testified. And I will tell you, I've had a lot of cases where someone was supposed to testify that was in the jail with my client. It's the first time it's ever happened. I'm glad it did. I found him interesting. But he disagreed with Director Fitzpatrick that there are predators and prey in prison. He said there are wolves and sheep. And to his face, he kind of had to describe his friend Tanner as an itty-bitty little baby lamb. He's trying to prepare him for what he's moving into. But you've heard what a struggle that is. And finally, you don't have to believe any of these. You've seen it with your own eyes. The state played all these videos for you. You've seen what Tanner's like around authority figures, around security. You can see how threatening they thought he was. The arrest video, completely compliant, no resistance, does exactly what they tell him. He asked about maybe moving his cuffs because they were uncomfortable. They just took his cuffs off. I'm not worried about him. Standing there, drawing on the board, they're standing right next to him. I don't even do that always with all of my clients because you never know. I have some that are dangerous. Tanner's not. They stood right beside him. Nobody was worried. They drove him around looking for Athena. No incidents. They put him in the front seat. Stood outside chatting with him about Waffle House, smoking a cigarette. Nobody's worried. And while tried to give you evidence, the state played those videos for you. Ultimately, the burden's on them. They have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Tanner Horner is going to be a continuing threat to society in a prison setting with his classification, G3, with their constant workups, with the many housing options they have, that he's going to be a continuing threat to society, and he just isn't. So that's where we come back to that oath that you all took to follow the law. And this is the law. The law isn't that you get the death sentence because that capital murder was worse than another capital murder. They're all terrible. This one is terrible. But he will spend the rest of his life in prison for it.
Sanders.
Good morning. I'm here to talk to you about special issue number 2. I promise you I'm not going to sit up here and rehash the experts' testimony. You have the reports. You have their notes. You heard what they said from the witness stand. I'm also not going to stand up here and rehash all the evidence. You heard the evidence. And if you have questions about what the evidence showed, you have the absolute right to come, to knock on that door and ask the judge, hey, we have a question about that evidence. But when it comes to special issue number 2, we're talking about the mitigation aspect of it. And we only get to special issue number 2 if each and every one of you has decided that the state has proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt that Tanner Horner is a continuing threat to society. Only if all 12 of you agree will we even get to this part. But in order to understand this, in order to understand the importance of mitigation, especially in this case, you have to understand child development. Because understanding how a child develops is key to understanding the man Tanner is today, but also the person that was in that van on November 30th of 2022. Tanner's problems began before he was even born. And we know that child development begins in utero. So Tanner's mother drank alcohol heavily during that first 8-week period of her pregnancy. We also know that she smoked cigarettes. We also know that she smoked marijuana. And the result in this case was a diagnosis of fetal alcohol syndrome disorder. Now, FASD is a neurodevelopmental disorder that is characterized by emotional dysregulation, cognitive impairments, problem-solving abilities, and other issues. Now, how do we know that FASD is a valid diagnosis? It was supported by the testing. It was supported by imaging. You have the reports, you can read those. The fact that he was diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome disorder is uncontroverted. There are several phases to child development. We know that it begins in utero, but once you're born, you have to learn to explore your own world. Now, where does this happen? When a child is born, their parents are the world. From your parents, you learn love, you learn safety, you learn security. But what happens to a child that doesn't have all of those? Now, again, it's undisputed that his mother loved him very much. But did she have the ability to provide security? Did she have the ability to provide safety? She didn't. During this crucial part of his development, rather than providing him that security and safety, what did his mother do? Left a 10-month-old child, baby, with a 10-year-old cousin to babysit. Not just for a few hours, not just late into the evening, but overnight, and for multiple days at a time. Now, the babysitter, even at that young age, realized that something was just a little off with Tanner. He wasn't like the other kids. One minute he was running around like the Tasmanian devil, and at other times he would put himself in timeout and face the corner and be still. But the other thing she noticed is he liked to eat coins. She had to put him up on the shelf so he could not get to these coins. He loved to eat coins and then go to the bathroom, poop them out, and then try to fish them out and do it all over again. She had to hide the change because he was his own ATM machine. And that's important because, according to the experts, that was also indicative of ADHD. Also, during this critical time period of development, his mother was in and out of the picture all the time. We know that she had her own issues. We know that she was in and out of jail. We know that she was in and out of drug rehab facilities. But that impeded Tanner's ability to have attachments. And Dr. Brahms talked to you about the importance of having a parent with whom you can form attachments. She talked about how important it was to have a parent from whom you can learn your coping skills. She talked about the importance of having a parent who could help bond and shape their behaviors. We didn't have this with Tanner's mother. She's a brave woman in many respects. She was brave enough to recognize that she could not provide for her son in the way that she wanted to. She had the desire, she did not have the ability. So she did the most heartbreaking thing that I think a parent could ever do, and that is give up her son to her mother to raise. And that was a very brave thing to do because she knew that Tanner would be loved by the grandmother and would be safe while she went to go to rehab to get clean. She also knew that she had legal problems and spent a good time in jail as well. Socialization. It's the next phase of childhood development. Socialization occurs when children are learning, basically how to navigate in the world. And you look at it like when you're a baby and you're a child, again, your parents are your world. Your crib is your environment. You have the safety of the confines of your own home. and then you go to pre-K, and then you go to daycare, and your world changes. It's a whole new environment. You don't have that safety net of your mom sitting next to you. You don't have that safety net of your wubby around with you. You have new experiences, new people, new things coming at you from all over the place. And if you are not equipped with the skills to navigate and to socialize, then that can impede your development. So we know that his grandmother had enrolled Tanner into daycare, Miss Diana's. And for the first time, Tanner had the opportunity to really socialize with children his own age outside of the home and outside of the family. But what happened at Miss Diana's? Well, Jackie watched as her only grandson tried to play with the other kids and was rejected. Tried to have conversations and was rebuffed. He tried to make friends, but he wasn't able to, and eventually he would just go sit on his own. That was when it was suggested that Tanner get tested. And what was the result? That was when the family learned that Tanner had Asperger's. Jackie and Melissa took their son to a clinic in Fort Worth. And it was there that they had the answer that they had been seeking. Why is my grandson different? Why is my son different? They knew he was different, but just looking at him, can you really tell? But they knew he was just a little off, so they took him in. Now, Asperger's is another neurodevelopmental disorder that's characterized by communication issues and social interaction difficulties. Now, all of those you could see at Miss Diana's when he tried to play with the kids. Now, Asperger's is not curable. Once you have Asperger's, you will always have Asperger's. You may learn some coping skills and some techniques to control the symptoms. You might learn how to have good eye contact. You might learn how to engage. You might learn how to do other things to help mask your symptoms. But at the end of the day, you still have Asperger's. And now Asperger's today falls under the autism spectrum disorder. So based on this diagnosis of the Asperger's, of the ASD, Tanner received special services in school. And you met the school psychologist who confirmed the diagnosis. You met the fifth grade teacher who talked about the difficulties that Tanner was having in school. And you also met the speech pathologist who helped him. The next phase of development is what was described as the mastery of one's own environment. Now, mastery of your environment is the capacity to effectively manage and manage our lives. And it teaches us how to manage our surroundings. That's when we learn. But it's difficult to manage your life and manage your surroundings when you have no stability in the home. And again, it goes back to the fact that Melissa was in and out of the house. Melissa had and had not custody of Tanner. He bounced between schools. He bounced between homes. He bounced between caregivers. He even bounced between rehab facilities with his mother. That is not stability. He moved out of the safety and security of his grandmother's home into a drug rehab facility. And where was his dad during all of this? Well, we knew that his father had legal problems. We knew that his father was an addict. We knew that his father was in and out of his life as much as his mother was, if not more. But during this phase of development, that was when one of the worst things that had happened to Tanner occurred. When he was 10 years old, he and his mother were living on a farm, and he and his cousin set fire. They were playing, and this fire got out of control. Well, his mother did the right thing sent him down to the landlord to apologize for what had happened. So rather than accepting the apology and saying, no harm, no foul, I'm so glad you did this, thank you for apologizing, what did the landlord do? He anally raped Tanner. All because he accidentally set fire to a field. And we know that the records reflect that he had issues in school during that time period. The medical records reflect that he had issues with hemorrhoids and constipation. All of those are indicative of that type of trauma. We also know that he had difficulty admitting that and talking about it to the experts that were involved in this case. And that's not uncommon either. So after having suffered that trauma, Tanner transitioned into middle school, where he was still receiving services. Now again, you met with or you heard from the in-home facilitator who tried to teach him social skills. And he was responding, did a great job. She loved hanging out with him, loved taking him out into the community, loved watching him develop. But she also talked to you about how difficult it was at home because, as much as Jackie loved him, she just wasn't getting it. As much as Bill loved him, his grandfather, he just wasn't getting it. As much as his mother loved him, she still wasn't getting it. And she and Melissa and Bill, none of them were allowed to continue with, and none of them followed through with any of the lessons that the in-home facilitator taught. And she said, he still needs them. But the school decided they were going to discontinue the services. Now, during your adolescence, you learn from Dr. Brahms that identity begins to form. And we shape our own identities, remember back in high school where you experimented with different friends, different cliques, different hairdos, different clothes styles, looking for who you are and trying to find who you are. This stage of development is especially difficult for one who has level 1 autism. Why is that? Because just looking at somebody, you can't tell if they're level 1 autistic. But the thing is, they know they're a little different. They know they're a little off. They know that they just don't quite fit in. They start to see themselves as an outcast. They start hanging out with other people that they identify with, other outcasts, and it becomes that self-fulfilling prophecy. When we talk about identity, we have to ask ourselves, what is it like to be Tanner Horner? And Tanner described himself as being an android when everybody else is an apple. And he feels like a robot, but that defaults to human emotions. And that's important because it shows that he recognizes that he's just a little different, but so wants to fit in. The other thing that Dr. Brahms talked about was how important it is to have someone in your life during this critical phase that can encourage you, that can recognize your successes, give you that positive feedback that you want and that you need. He didn't have any of this. Again, he had a mother who loved him, but she was struggling with her own issues, the legal problems, the drug addiction, her own personal trauma. He had a grandmother who loved him, but she was also struggling with her own personal traumas, the traumas that she herself suffered, the traumas that were inflicted upon her daughter that she harbored such guilt for. She also had her own physical health to contend with. The last phase of childhood development that we learned about was emancipation into adulthood. And that's where we talk about where we have developed coping skills to become the integrated adult that we are. Now, what do we mean by an integrated adult? Well, that means that be able to absorb what is around you and take that in and make your decisions based upon what you've learned. No one at home taught him how to do this. He had no coping skills. His default became avoidance. He avoided everything. He deflected to music, to anime, to movies. And he never learned to deal properly with the stressors in his life. So we talked about interventions. And it's no doubt that Tanner had a lot of interventions. He had the speech pathologist during middle school. He had the content mastery teacher in high school. He had Beth. He had his fifth grade teacher helped him out. But remember what you learned is that if you don't continue with these interventions, use it or lose it. He didn't have anybody at home that could help him use it, and so you just kind of fall off. And it's also important to note that high school content mastery, it was available to everybody, and it really did work for him. It helped him graduate. Now, granted, he graduated in like the bottom 5% of his class, but he went on to graduate. After he graduated, things kind of drifted from band to band, from job to job, and then he met the mother of his child. They fell in love, moved in together, and they had a child. But moving in and having a fiance and having a baby isn't the same as settling down. They moved around a lot. They still had a lot of chaos in their lives. They bounced between her mother's house, his grandmother's house. They lived with friends. They had their own apartment, all these different things. So there was still chaos in the life. They also had financial difficulties. We know that the mother of his child was suffering from postpartum issues. She wasn't able to work, wasn't able to keep the house, wasn't able to do all the things that she wanted to do, except go out and party. And we know that that's what they did, even though they were trying to save money to buy a place of their own. So Tanner was trying to be the only breadwinner, keep his fiance happy, save up to get the place of their own. So they never could seem to get ahead. They always had these issues. And then the car that they had broke down, so they had to get a new car. Kept rolling and rolling and rolling, and his boss came in and gave him $1,100. But that also added another layer of stress, because now Tanner had to work 6 days a week in order to pay that $150 a week back. When he took the job at FedEx, he thought that that would give him some stability in life. That's what he was hoping. And for a while it did. They still had the money problems, and they were working through all of that. But he had the root nasal. That's where he grew up. He knew those streets. He was able to do his roots without issue. And then his route got changed. Added another layer of stress. Another layer of stress that he was not able to cope with. When the route changed, the anxiety increased. New routes, new roads, new people, new routine. And that's what led up to this offense. We don't forget Athena. We don't. Because on November the 30th, 2022, Tanner did something that changed the lives of all of us. Every single person in this room has been affected by Tanner's actions. On that day, Tanner delivered the packages to Athena's house, Barbie's. And he got out, delivered the package, decided to snort a little cocaine because he had had insomnia, was tired, had all these other issues. And she saw him, and he thought that she was going to tell on him. And if she told, he would lose his job. If he lost his job, he would lose his car. If he lost his car, he wouldn't be able to have transportation for the baby. If he didn't have transportation for the baby, something could happen. He couldn't do this. It just kept snowballing in his mind. Now, there was no planning. There was no premeditation. There was, no preparation. You kept hearing about all of these stickies being put on the lens cover. But let me ask you this. If you were planning to abduct a child, would you cover the lens cap before you did it or after you did it? It doesn't make sense, and that's where their assertions fall apart. It does make sense that he would have covered a lens cap to hide the fact that he was vaping weed. It does make sense that he would hide the lens cap or cover the camera lens if he was snorting some cocaine. It does make sense that he would do all of that, but it doesn't make sense that he would wait until after she was in the van to cover the lens cap. All of this was caught on video and audio. And like I said, there's not a person in this room that heard that was not deeply affected by that. We all were, and we all will have to carry that with us for the rest of our lives. No one should have to go through what Maitland Gandy and Jacob Strand went through. No one should have to bury their child. And when a child is taken in the way that she was taken, it's natural for us to be angry. We should be angry. We should be furious that her life was taken from her in that manner. We have every right to be, and we should be. And it's natural for us to want to know why this happened. But you know what? We won't ever know why it happened. It's easy to sit here and blame the autism, the lead exposure, the FASD, the ADHD, the mental health issues. It would be easy for us to do that. And the state keeps telling me that that's exactly what we did. But remember, every single witness that we asked, is this an excuse? This isn't a defense. This isn't a justification. And every single one was like, no. The fact that he has autism is not an excuse for killing Athena. The fact that he has fetal alcohol syndrome disorder does not excuse the attempted sexual assault. The fact that he has lead exposure does not excuse the murder. It is no excuse. It is not a defense. It is not a justification. But what all of these diagnoses do is it kind of helps explain how we got to this point, how we got there. Now, the state wants you to believe that unless you're sitting in a corner drooling all over yourself, you are not impaired. But every single expert in the field said level 1 impairment is still impairment. Mild is still impairment. Moderate is still impairment. You just aren't a little pregnant. You either are or you're not. You are not a little autistic. You are or you aren't. You are not just a little alcohol exposed. You are or you aren't. There is no, if you are, you are. So the important thing to remember about these diagnoses is that they are not what we call additive. It doesn't mean he has autism plus FASD plus lead exposure plus ADHD plus mental health. That's not how it works. All of the experts testified that this is a compounding issue. So it would be autism times FASD times ADHD times lead exposure times all the other mental health issues. And so it doesn't boil down to, well, you had bad upbringing, you didn't kill anybody. Well, did that person also have autism? Did they also have FASD? Did they also have ADHD? Did they also have lead exposure? So we have these false equivalents going on throughout the state's questioning. It isn't a false equivalent. It is a compounding issue. So, again, what does it all mean? We know that Tanner had a history of catastrophizing. We know that. And in the most simplistic terms, it's making a mountain out of a molehill. And when he thought that Athena saw him doing cocaine, it never dawned on him that she wouldn't know what it meant. It never dawned on him that she might not recognize that what he was doing was wrong. In his mind, he jumped from point A to point Z in the most irrational fashion. So somehow, somebody, a child seeing him do something that they may or may not understand, ended up in him losing his child, losing his car, and being evicted from his house. So that's how his brain worked. And once he made the decision, the very bad decision, to take her, it just snowballed out of there. He didn't know how to get out of it. He wasn't able to reason and think about the consequences of his actions. And again, that's not anything new, because you heard from the teachers who recognized that issue all the way back in 5th grade. So this isn't something that the defense cooked up to try to get him out of it. No, we have the documentation from it. And you have those records. You can look at those records. You can take every single bit of evidence back there and go through it. You have that right. Just ask the judge to send it back with you. The catastrophizing isn't new either. You saw that also through many stories that you heard from the witness stand, especially the one where they talked about him losing his patience over at Outback over the dishes piling up. He was overwhelmed and wasn't able to cope. So rather than asking for help, which we kind of would probably think the normal person would do, no. He became overwhelmed and he quit because he couldn't handle it. And we talk about these diagnoses and how they are presented. Well, they were on full display during the interrogation videos. Full display. Dr. Brahms told you that every 5th sentence in those interrogation videos were diagnostic for her. Now, we know that he lied. We do. But as Steve pointed out, lying goes back to the dawn of time when we've tried to cover something that we have done wrong. It's not anything new. Officer Amy lied to cover her tracks. Joe Espinoza lied to try to get a confession. We have, to say that because he lied about the multiple personality disorder should discount everything else we know in this case is just a bunch of hooey. What we have to ask the question we have to ask ourselves is, was this lying a manipulation, or was it just a way of enabling himself to confess? Did Tanner actually confess? Yes, he did. But he did it in a different way. He took on the persona of Zero to enable him to make that confession. And we know that it's not uncommon for people with autism to speak about their person, speak about their brains in the third person, because it makes them easier to talk about their issues. It makes it easier for them to admit to things that they're embarrassed about, that they're ashamed of, that they're afraid of. But at the end of the day, was there a confession? And I got to ask you this, and we asked one of the witnesses, I can't remember which one, but we asked, did Tanner really think that he was fooling anybody by adopting that persona? I mean, Ranger Espinoza wasn't buying it. I don't think any of us was buying it. But, due to Tanner's lack of theory of mind, he was not able to perceive that the other people were not buying what he was trying to sell. And again, at the end of the day, he confessed to the crime and eventually led the officers to Athena's body.
You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Now, during jury selection, we talked about, what was important for you to hear in order to make your decision. And we heard responsibility, remorse, rehabilitation. Well, responsibility, Tanner confessed. He confessed to the offense. Responsibility, he stood in front of you and entered a plea of guilty. He entered a plea of guilty knowing that the result would be he would spend the rest of his life in prison. Remorse. Now, I remember when my mother passed away. I was angry at everything. I was angry at the world, angry at God, angry at my family, because I didn't think that they were grieving the way that I thought they should grieve. So I went to church and I spoke with my priest and we did a little grief counseling, and what he taught me was that everybody grieves their own way. And it's right. If it's right how you grieve, it is right. It's the same thing with remorse. If we all show remorse differently. We do. And just because it's not shown in a way that you want it to be shown doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And let me ask this question. How does a person with autism, where one of the characteristics is they are not able to express their emotions, how do they effectively communicate what those emotions are in a way that is satisfactory to the world around him? Well, you saw the remorse in Tanner. You saw it on the interrogation videos. Even Ranger Espinosa noted that, I see the remorse in you. I believe you're remorseful. You saw it in the suicide note that he wrote when he had nothing left to lose. And he had nothing left to gain at the time. He apologized to the family for what he did and expressed his regret and remorse. You saw it in his face when the video of the incident was replayed. Again, just because he may not express it the way everybody else does not mean that his remorse is not there. Rehabilitation. You heard about what he did in jail. You did. You heard about all of the courses that he took. You learned about the fact that he found God again and that he wanted to help his other inmates find God. And that was his new purpose. He reached out to Chicken and they started a Bible study. Even though they had to talk through the bean chute, even though they couldn't share their own Bibles with each other, they had that Bible study and it was important to him. The note that Chicken wrote him is in evidence. I encourage you to take it back and read it, because that was written by a man who wanted to express his gratitude for helping him find God again. The things that in life that created deficits for Tanner in the real world are the things that are going to serve him best in prison. Structure, clearly stated rules. And we know that structure worked for him because it worked for him in school. You heard that from the teachers. It worked for him when he worked for Jason. You heard that from Jason. It worked for him in Wise County where he had no disciplinary actions. It worked for him in Tarrant County where he had no disciplinary actions. The only time when he didn't have the structure in his life, he flailed and he failed, and that's why he's sitting in the defense chair right now. You know, the decision to end another human's life is a deeply personal one. And each of you was selected to be on this jury because, you promised us that you would follow the law. You promised us, you promised the judge, you promised the state, you promised us that you would follow the law regardless of where the evidence took you, regardless of your personal feelings. You promised you would listen to all the evidence and you would hold the state to their burden of proof. But now is the time for you to fulfill the oath that you took. And the state of Texas never requires a death sentence. Not in this case, not in any case, not even in the worst case you can possibly imagine. They're always satisfied with a verdict of life without parole. And you are going to be tasked with answering special issue number 1 and special issue number 2. Did the state prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Tanner Horner is a continuing threat to society? No, they didn't. In fact, evidence to the contrary, it's uncontroverted that he has adjusted well to jail life. It is uncontroverted that he has no disciplinary actions. It is uncontroverted that he has been allowed to have access to all of these people in the jail without incident. But if you answer yes, that only makes him eligible for the death penalty. It doesn't mean it is automatic. And that's where we get to special issue number 2. Mitigation is any reason for any one of you to choose life. And it can be individual for each of you. That's why we talked about your individual moral judgment during jury selection. You have the absolute right to pick and choose what is or is not mitigating to you. And if you have found something that is sufficiently mitigating that would warrant a sentence of life without parole rather than the death sentence, you have the absolute right to vote your conscience. You have the absolute right to have your voice heard. So when you go back in that jury room, what I want you to do is I want you to talk to each other. And y'all have been talking for like the last 5 weeks, and what's a little more talk, right? I want you to talk to each other about your lives, about your experiences, about the things that make you who you are. Talk about what you saw. Talk about your children. And then what I want you to do is speak up. I want you to speak up. If you have a reason to choose life, speak up. Because that is your right. Your truth is your truth, just like your other jurors' truths are their own truths. Honestly, I don't envy you. I can't imagine being in your position and having to make this decision that you're about to make. It's probably going to be one of the most important decisions you will ever make in your life, because you hold a man's life in your hands. And your decision, it'll define who you are. And are you going to be merciful? Are you going to be benevolent? Are you going to be vengeful? Because mercy isn't earned. Mercy is freely given. That's why we call it mercy. Then ask yourself, do you really stand for life? And if you can answer that question, then I want you to raise your hand, and I want you to vote your conscience, and I want you to vote for life. And that's why we are asking you to sentence Tanner to life without the possibility of parole. Thank you.